Okay, so in this video, we're going to look at another example of the social effects of industrialization on Europe's periphery. And in this case, we're going to look at the emancipation of serfdom, of the serfs in Russia. So we are going to bring up a few of the political ideas in this video, and this will serve as a nice introduction to some of these political ideas because that's the next big topic that we're going to look at are the political effects of industrialization. And so towards the end of the video, we'll start talking about some of the political ideologies that arise as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So we've talked in the past about serfdom in Russia. So let's do a brief history. We'll take a brief look at Russian serfdom. Now, this story goes way back, kind of way before the scope of our course. So we'll start this story around 1300. And so around 1300, Russian nobles began taking away the rights of peasants to make it easier to use the peasants to fight back against the Mongols. So, in addition to being soldiers, it was easier to tax them and get cheaper labor. So by taking away the rights of the peasants, obviously you could use them as soldiers, just take away their farming implements and give them something to fight with. Really, we're talking about taking away one pointy stick and giving them a different pointy stick to fight Mongols with. But it was also easier to tax them, and you could also pay them less. And once the Russians had beaten the Mongols, once the Mongols were defeated, the rights were never restored. The rights were never restored, and the peasants became serfs. So, technically speaking, A serf is not a slave. A serf is part of the land. But in reality, a serf in Russia was treated like a slave, but not really abused like we might think of African slaves in the Caribbean or in European colonies. They weren't really abused or killed or died on the job. They weren't really abused, but they really had no freedom or rights. So they were pretty much stuck being a serf. They couldn't really leave. They really had no rights. They had no money. They were stuck doing that job. Now, it's marginally better than being a slave because people aren't trying to kill you and you're not being worked to death. But it's not a pleasant situation to be found in either. And this was the system the Russians employed until the mid 1800s. Like they used this to create the army that defeated Napoleon. So even up until, the 19th century, this was working for them. And when I say them, I mean the Russian government, not the serfs. So, jumping ahead now to the Crimean War, which I think we've mentioned before. So, the Crimean War, which we will deal with in its entirety when we get there, the Crimean War was a military disaster for the Russians. And it was clear that Russia needed to industrialize to keep up with the United Kingdom and France, who had just beat them in this war, which went from 1856 to 1859. So, in order to kind of copy the British model, Tsar Alexander II emancipated the serfs in 1861. Right around the same time, Lincoln emancipated the slaves in the United States. So this is kind of happening at the same time. The idea was that the serfs would move to cities and become industrial workers like the British farmers did. There's a problem with this line of thinking, though. The serfs, unlike the British farmers, had no land of their own or money of their own, and so couldn't move to the cities. Like, they didn't have any money to move with. The British farmers, they owned a little bit of land and they could sell it to give them the money they needed to go to the city, find a place to live, and start working. The serfs had no money, they had no land to sell, and so they couldn't move to the cities. What most serfs ended up doing most worked for the noble who they used to work for, but now they had to pay rent. And let's go back to the first point. They had no money to do so. So the nobles loaned them money to pay rent, but now they're stuck in a debt cycle with interest rates that are too high to fully pay everything back. This is a system called debt peonage. And that's where the serfs found themselves. That's where a lot of serfs found themselves. If they were lucky, some of the serfs lived on communal land that was owned by the serf or the former serf community. That was another option. This one was marginally better because you weren't stuck in that awful cycle of debt, but you were trapped on the land because no one person could sell the land. So you were trapped there. So you could live and farm, but that was it. There was no wealth here. And the other side of the story is that, yeah, the serfs couldn't become industrial workers, but the nobles who might have invested in new businesses or industries now lost a big amount of money, or large amount of money, because their serfs are gone. And remember, I think we've mentioned this before, the nobles would mortgage their serfs to get loans. So if the Tsar was hoping that he could create artificially the British model of industrialization, on both sides he failed. The serfs cannot become industrial workers because they don't have any money to move to cities to become workers. And even if they could, there's not any businesses for them to work in. There aren't any factories because the people who might have invested in factories just lost a bunch of money because their serfs are gone. So there's no one to build factories and there's no one to work in the factories. So what ends up happening here as a result of this? What are the consequences of this? And here we're going to start to kind of preview some political ideologies. So instead of getting liberalism, which is kind of the slow, gradual expansion of political rights, which is basically what we're going to see in the United Kingdom. We see radical alternatives embraced in Russia. So the nobility becomes very conservative. They were burned once by somebody expanding people's political rights. They don't want any more changes. So they become very resistant to further changes. The serfs, who the Tsar probably wanted to start to kind of slowly push for their own political rights, the serfs turn to socialism, which pushes for a redistribution of wealth and public ownership of the means of production. or anarchism, which is a removal of government restrictions to allow people to govern themselves. Now, without going too deep down these paths, because we're going to spend entire class periods on these issues, you could be a socialist and an anarchist and work within the system. The serfs, however, became radicalized and violent. Well, some became radicalized and violent, and the Tsar that was actually their emancipator was assassinated by former serfs. In 1881. His son, Alexander III, will become as violent and reactionary, but in a conservative way. The last thing I'll say is that when Russia does industrialize, it will be completely done by the state. So the government will industrialize. No private individuals are doing the industrialization. The government is going to industrialize Russia, which means it gets what it wants. So it's going to get the stuff that the government wants, not stuff that the people want. So it's going to get trains and telegraphs and electricity and guns and steel. That's not to say that those things weren't used by the people, but we see very little consumer goods. And I guess the biggest consequence of all is that eventually the Russian Empire and the Tsar will be overthrown by radicals who were radicalized by the emancipation of the serfs. So the ultimate demise of Russia and the start of the Soviet Union can be tied back directly to the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. So that ends our stuff on the social effects of the Industrial Revolution. And our next set of videos will be looking at the political effects of the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to start back at the beginning and go visit our old friend Napoleon and see what happened after he finally got defeated. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.